So in keeping with regional protocol, we acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where we are situated, where we live, and where this workshop is taking place. In this acknowledgement, our intention is to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and to mourn the harms, some ongoing, of the distant and recent past. And it's important for us to, I know it's written, but it's important for us to say that out loud. And as things unfold, you will appreciate why this is one of the slides that we read throughout.
In addition to our territorial acknowledgement, we would also like to acknowledge some intellectual traditions whose resources we are borrowing, specifically Black radical intellectual thought, feminist thought, and Latin American thought. We are honored to think with these traditions and bring them into contexts that were not part of their development. So I think we have a poll. Do we have a poll set up? Okay, so we'd like to see if you are from Buffalo, Western New York, generally, and if you're faculty, staff, student, or community. So we can tailor some of our reflections to the audience. Things might get a little bit Buffalo specific here. Ooh, real-time results, this is fun.
Yeah, wow. A lot of non-Buffalo people.
Okay, all right.
So we're up to 93% have voted. That's beautiful voter turnout.
That's great information. So what we're seeing is that we have a majority of people who are not from Buffalo or Western New York. We have a large percentage of staff or administration. Great. Okay. Thank you. And there will be another opportunity to kind of ask some questions along the way as we move through this. Oops. For some reason, I'm stuck on my slides. Hold on. Still stuck, hold on. Still stuck. I don't know what's going on here, guys, I'm sorry. Devanya, I'm gonna pull up a different version of the PowerPoint. So why don't you talk about what brings us here and our experiences with service learning and service immersion.
All right, well, you're doing that. So Melissa and I are both veterans of immersions. We have worked for quite some time in religious-oriented colleges. In particular, schools that are in the Jesuit tradition have an ongoing student experience that they describe as immersion. And what happens in immersion is that students are taken often 3,000–4,000 miles away from the United States to immerse themselves in communities that have been marginalized. Melissa and I have done these types of immersions in India, El Salvador, the Philippines. Am I leaving anything out?
That covers me.
Okay, that covers me. And so among our experiences there, first, we are incurring an extreme expense to go a long way away to be engaged with people that we can only have a distant relationship with. In other words, we are not exercising the same critical or engaged lens in communities that are in our backyard or communities where we're already embedded. And there's some problems that emerge with that. You want to jump in, Melissa?
Nope.
So the final thing, I guess we'll say in terms of our introduction is that one of the things we thought long and hard about with Immersion Eastside is not only giving a view of a community as oppressed and marginalized, but looking at a community to better understand the resiliency, the creativity, the ways in which those communities have created solutions when other groups would not come in and offer assistance. We talk about people who are being disinvested by governmental entities, people who live in communities where banks are not coming in to give loans, where small businesses struggle. And so there's a kind of resiliency there, coupled with a joy despite these material conditions. And a lot of what we're after is not only understanding the intellectual and theoretical aspects of that, but also giving credit to people who I like to describe as inventing in the midst of a desert, creating possibility out of impossibility.
And in addition to the international service immersions that Devanya and I have done, we've also both worked at mission-driven schools for quite some time and have incorporated service learning into our classes to varying degrees of success. And a lot of what informs this presentation is the reflections on our students' experiences doing service learning, and as faculty members, what our experience has been trying to get the best out of service learning, and sometimes encountering severe challenges in doing that. I want to open up this next question to everyone to use the chat function, and maybe we can just get some read off here. You know, why do we do service learning? Sometimes we have different goals in mind, and to be clear about our goals and objectives is going to be important. What do we want students to take away from service learning? And what struggles do we face meeting these goals? So we like to give everyone a few minutes to kind of type into the chat function any reflections you have on these, and we can read through them before we move on with our own reflections on that. Okay, to transform ourselves, our community, and our power structures, to get outside our own worlds, a high impact practice for student learning, connecting students with the community they're living in, authentic opportunities for social justice, real life experiences, of course, linking course content to non-academic settings, knowing our community, giving back to our community. A lot about building connections. I think that's definitely something that's important here. Address community-defined needs, students as agents of social change, exposing students to more cultures.
Helping students connect in the classroom with work in the community and assist community organizations, building relationships that empower, expanding student comfort zone, help worlds collide that don't otherwise, often due to xenophobic power structures that have existed for centuries. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't need service learning, but we do because of how the world is structured. Yeah.
Yeah, and leveraging university assets is in there. I think that's something really important to think about too, is
right.
Universities as institutions with a lot of assets that can be leveraged for community needs.
Yes. And part of one that talks about become aware of social structures that perpetuate injustice and engage in social change work of community partners, namely struggle to avoid replicating or strengthening existing hierarchies of privilege and oppression.
All right. I think we're gonna speak to a lot of these goals, and some of the struggles and challenges that were noted in this.
Right. So we're really going to open up with a framework that looks much at the struggles and challenges, and then we will close after a break for questions with a discussion of some things that we have found to be effective. And as always, understand this as ongoing, experimental, and aspirational. In other words, we're going to do this imperfectly, but we can share things that have worked for us as possibility models.
So in the literature on service learning, there are a number of common criticisms that you find on why service learning can be unsuccessful, or why service learning can often be harmful in the worst cases. We see a lot of discussion of poverty voyeurism and exploitation. So poverty voyeurism being this kind of tour through impoverished or disinvested neighborhoods for students to be exposed to something different. And we think that is a form of exploitation, exploiting communities that have already suffered marginalization and injustice. Service learning can also produce attitudes of white saviorism and paternalism, where students, and I'm using white here as a stand-in too, because sometimes it's students of color who might feel this way as well, that, that we are going out to help and to save others. And that our work is going to solve all the problems that other people might experience in their lives. And this goes hand in hand with a kind of paternalism, that we as teachers, or we as college students, or we as administrators, or we as institutions, we know what's best. This idea that we know what's best for the community, and we know what communities need, and we're going to bring that to them. And that's dangerous. And as we'll talk about, it ignores and sidesteps community wisdoms on their own lives. It often centers student experience over community wisdoms. And this is a reflection that Devanya and I have come to after reading hundreds and hundreds of papers and reflections from students on community-based learning and on their service learning experiences. We often find that students are not prepared to engage with the knowledge that's produced in communities they enter, but rather they are only prepared to reflect on their experiences of happiness and joy, or feeling good about themselves for helping others. And that can definitely be a part of service learning, but it often centers the experience they have over trying to form coalitions with members of communities other than their own. Service learning also is criticized for lacking intellectual and academic rigor, that it's not serious research, that it's not often tied closely enough to the learning goals and objectives of courses. And because oftentimes it uses a model of reflection, it's often thought not to be academic enough. I don't necessarily always agree with that criticism, but I think it's definitely something to be concerned with. And we also think that there is a methodological confusion about service learning in the literature. Is service learning a kind of pedagogy? Is it a tool that we use for teaching? Is it an approach, an intentional approach to how we teach? Or is it a text? Are we using the communities that we are in and that we go into, that we travel to, as a kind of text from which we can learn? And both of these could be colonial approaches to service learning. And I think sometimes in the execution of service learning in classrooms and in other areas of the college, this confusion can result in unsuccessful service learning experiences. And we have our own experiences with service learning over decades, combined decades of doing it in higher education. Devanya, do you want to jump in here? Add any reflections on your own experience with service learning?
Well, I think some of the things that Melissa alluded to with respect to students being prepared to go into communities that they're unfamiliar with often creates some of the tensions we're trying to draw out in the criticisms of service learning. For example, many students that I encounter find that their service learning experiences, well, I'm observing as the teacher, I look at their commenting on their service learning experiences as an indication of how their already existing biases have been reinforced. So an example that I ran into a lot is, so why are people who are, their words, poor, in poverty, why do they spend money on, a lot of money on name brand sneakers? Why don't they just buy these inexpensive sneakers? What if people pursued education? Wouldn't that be a simple way out of poverty? Why don't people just work harder? All of these kinds of things that begin to creep into understandings based on number one and number two, for example. And it's not enough to sort of talk about the experience and reflect on the experience. There's some deeper requirements there, which we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, that in my years of doing service learning, both at Canisius and at other institutions, I began to worry very, very severely about whether or not service learning worked to disrupt already existing biases or reconfirm already existing biases. And that's something that I began to struggle with and had to kind of alter some of my teaching around service learning to accommodate.
Right, and what was I going to say? I think one of a common shared experience that Melissa and I have is that students talk about how grateful they are to have what they have. And to me, that's a way of not critically examining the conditions under which the disparities are produced.
So we're going to move on and kind of get into the meat of our thesis here, that service learning can be a kind of colonialism. So Devanya, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I don't want to read and unpack this whole Quijano quote, but when we talk about colonialism, we're not merely talking about the idea of going into a space and colonizing it and embedding ourselves in it. We're also talking about the structures that frame spaces in colonial terms. So how is it that certain power relationships appear natural and normal? So we can go back to what I was talking about earlier, this idea of people being able to, without some kind of structural assistance, work their way out of poverty, for example. This is a structural condition that we need to unpack, and it's very complicated. And so often the way we frame our very understandings of what's going on is already informed by these, what we call colonial models.
So the coloniality of power then refers to the structures of power and control that constitute societies like ours. These could be economic structures and economic histories, political structures and political histories, and racial structures and racial histories. We're also going to add into that epistemic structures. Now, we're philosophers, so you have to bear with us in our use of technical philosophical language here. But when we talk about things as epistemological, we're talking about theories of knowledge. So knowledge produced, maintained, and who gets to be a reliable knower. We'll add that in as part of the coloniality of power.
Right, and fundamentally in simple terms, what counts as knowledge? Mm-hmm. So if I can understand how to navigate structures that exclude me, that's often contrasted with book knowledge or degree knowledge. And so we assert that that's part of a larger colonial structure that is designed to elevate certain aspects of culture and society and to place lower in value other aspects.
So we think that the coloniality of power can be present in service learning in a number of power relations. I'm going to talk about the first three, and then I'll turn it over to Devanya for the last two. I think the first power relation that we have to examine is the teacher-student power relation. This came up in the chat about, what are some, problems with service learning we might encounter. Is that the teacher forces students to do something that they might not want to do for academic credit. And that relationship of power can distort or inhibit the learning goals and objectives that that teacher might have. Right? The teacher selects the text, the teacher selects the communities and the projects that they can enter and engage with, and the teacher has the power of the gradebook over them. And this is a power relation that is just part of higher education generally, and not one that we can necessarily upend. But teachers in the process of service learning need to be able to examine the way that the power that they have is used over students. There's also a power relation that exists between institutions and communities. Those of you who are from Canisius or Buffalo know that Canisius is positioned on the very edge of what is called the east side of Buffalo. And the east side is historically disinvested community. Currently, it is predominantly Black community in Buffalo, and the zip codes that make up the east side are some of the poorest communities in Buffalo. And then we have a wealthy institution on the edge of that. And because, leaders in our institution, members of our boards of trustees, can wield a lot of power in the city of Buffalo and Erie County and Western New York generally, that institution can wield power over the communities in which they live or in which they exist. And oftentimes community members are displaced by institutions as they grow, or community members have to live in amongst college students, which some people don't enjoy. There's also a power relation that exists in service learning between the suburban and the urban. Now, the suburban and urban dichotomy is part of a lexicon that Devanya and I always try to disrupt for our students. We think that urban is a code word for poor and a code word for Black, because students talk about going into urban areas and they talk about the suburbs, but I don't think they actually know what suburbs are and what the urban is historically and really defined by policy either. And oftentimes our students from the suburbs, first ring, second ring suburbs, or further out into more rural Western New York, feel that their lives are different and better than those that live in more urban areas. And that kind of wielding of power and knowledge can affect their own experiences in service learning. Devanya?
Yes, thank you. I was looking at one of the questions, and before I get to my two, I just want to jump in because I think it's very relevant. Someone said, well, one of the slides talked about white privilege versus white supremacy. What's the difference? And I think that is related to this dichotomy between the intellectual and the quote unquote native. So when we think about white privilege, it is built into a larger structure and system that operates in a particular way, that operates to advantage certain kind of people that we have defined as white. And I say defined as white because who gets to be white shifts over time. It depends on where and when we're talking about whiteness, and it shifts over time. What is consistent, though, is that there is a structure that places at the top of the hierarchy whiteness, however it is defined in that moment, in such a way that whiteness becomes a kind of property to be protected. And so white supremacy is the description of that system and structure, whereas white privilege is, it relies on that structure, but it speaks more to the interpersonal everyday interactions that reinforce white supremacy. So I hope that's a helpful explanation, and feel free to ask questions like this as we go along. I would argue that this kind of distinction also speaks to this dichotomy that we produce between the intellectual and the native. For example, we are college professors, we know a lot, ostensibly, we've been trained, we have degrees, so there's something about the intellectual that is more important, more legitimate, more verified than what we might describe as the quote unquote native, the people to whom we're going to help, or the people who we are going to observe, or the people who we are demanding share their experience with us. In some ways, it's important that we remember we have to earn the privilege to hear people's stories, that it is not a given, nor do we necessarily have the requisite apparatus to really have deep understanding of those stories. And we'll talk a little more about how that builds out in terms of relationships. Finally, this idea that there is some kind of distinction between theory and practice. So it's reflected in the intellectual native distinction in terms of who gets privilege, who gets priority in the hierarchy. But we also think about theory as this thing that is typically unrelated to what we do in the world. And this is deeply problematic because, as Freire tells us, knowledge cannot be stripped of its historical and sociological conditioning, right? What we take to be knowledge, what we see as theory, is always already grounded in power relations. That means ultimately that it is impossible to do theory without also being engaged in practice. It also means that it is impossible to render a neutral education. Education is always going to be bound up in tension with a value system that we are given through coloniality.
Thank you, Devanya.
You're welcome.
So we're going to talk about 3 different theories of coloniality in knowledge production, or what we might call epistemology as philosophy teachers. We're going to talk about arrogant perception from the work of Marilyn Frye and Maria Lugones, Orientalism from the work of Andrea Pitts, and controlling images from the work of Patricia Hill Collins. The theory of arrogant perception originates with Marilyn Frye and is picked up by Maria Lugones. And arrogant perceivers do not identify with others. The other stands as an object that can be observed, that can be experienced, but that one does not feel connected to. An arrogant perceiver does not let the other affect them, does not let the other transform them. And the arrogant perceiver leaves their encounter with others exactly how they entered it. And so we worry sometimes that service learning can be a kind of arrogant perception, where there's a defense against the letting the experiences of others shape us, that we might have to lose something about our identities and our view of the world if we really take seriously the experiences that others have in our shared world. This is connected to Orientalism, and of course, the theory of Orientalism is goes much further back than the article that we linked to from Andrea Pitts. But Orientalism involves a view of the other as an object of knowledge that can be mastered and controlled. A view of the other where the other is just an object of knowledge and not a person who is dynamic and changing. It involves a distinction between the self and the other. So when we hear students talk about those people over there, when we hear students talk about their lives in the suburbs versus the lives of people they've encountered in urban areas, this sort of distinction between the self and the other is also a value distinction. And Orientalism in knowledge becomes a big problem because we then are using others as objects for our own intellectual gain. And that's why we identified it as a kind of exploitation towards the beginning. And connected to that is controlling images. And I will turn that one over to Devanya.
Okay. So we wanted to highlight this idea of controlling images, which we argue are different than stereotypes. So you can think of a stereotype falling under the umbrella of a controlling image. And so the distinction then would be that we have these snapshot images that really encapsulate an entire narrative that often justifies certain kinds of oppression. So to unpack that a bit, if we think about the idea of the, quote, welfare queen, who is living off the government and having children in order to get more government assistance, that would be an example of a controlling image because it begins to justify intrusive practices around people's personal lives. It justifies the stinginess of state support for certain peoples. It argues in some ways that the person is irresponsible for having children that they can't support. There are all kinds of things packed into that image. If we think more recently of an image of a Black man in a black hoodie who is somehow suspicious because he's wearing a hoodie, that would be a kind of controlling image. The idea that there are people illegally crossing borders to take jobs from hardworking Americans is a kind of controlling image. And so what happens in these images is that they objectify individuals and they place them in a particular way within power relations. And they give the impression that these things are natural and normal, that they are somehow responsible for their state in the world, and that everything is okay, that all these processes are fine. And this is, I would argue that this controlling image, especially, I'm going off script a bit, I would argue that these controlling images, especially around policing, are becoming unsettled. So we typically think, oh, that person is being dominated through force by police officers. What did they do wrong? Why aren't they innocent? And the idea of needing to see this outward expression of innocence belies a controlling image of seeing certain kinds of Blackness as always already criminal. And so controlling images do a kind of narrative work in a snapshot. Oh, okay, I've got the second piece. So we want to transition from these colonial ways of engaging with others, and we want to talk about our responsibility as a kind of ethics, an ethics of responsibility to other. And we put other in quotes because often we see these well-intentioned things as non-colonial, right? So we're all the same. Let's look for our similarities. I can relate to you because you have the same problems that I have. And so that also is a way of pushing off the other. And the kind of way I like to think about it is we have, and Patricia Williams says this, we have a temptation to imagine inclusiveness by imagining away any obstacles. So we want to foster inclusiveness often by pretending that there's not difference. And so when we invoke an ethics as responsibility to the other, we want to encounter that difference without trying to push it away, without trying to make those people we encounter the same as us. And they're not the same as us, which is why the interaction is going to be rich. And in order to foster connection, we need not be the same. And so for Levinas, who we're drawing upon, making that other the same as me is a form of killing the other, is a form of colonizing the other.
Right, and we often see this in students' reactions to service learning, and I think it was most stark for me during one of my service immersion trips to India with students. And students would say things, well, they're just like me. And yes, from a human level, yeah. But it has a way of erasing the experiences of the other. It's a form of erasure when we seek commonality rather than appreciate and recognize that difference. So there was a question from Lou in the chat about controlling images, about whether or not they have structural power more so than stereotypes. And I answered in the chat yes to that, that controlling images are maintained in and through power structures in order to deny subjects access to that power. Controlling images are always pernicious. Stereotypes need not be pernicious and harmful. But as Devanya said, the stereotypes could be a subset, or there's a relationship between them, but we can work with distinctions there too.
Right, and again, I think, and for later this will become important, we also need to think of controlling images as giving us a full-fledged narrative in a snapshot. I mean, for those of you old enough to remember the Willie Horton, the bringing out of Willie Horton during a presidential election, that's a kind of snapshot of terror about possible criminality, and that's a kind of controlling image, right? The controlling image of the female-headed households is also a dominating controlling image. In other words, if the households were more patriarchal, they would be successful. It denies the fact that poverty is the issue, not who's heading the household. And so they operate in to that prior discussion about structures of power, they operate in ways that make what we already think seem normal, natural, and just the way things are.
All right, so we built in a time here to kind of stop. I know that we threw a lot of theory out there, some philosophy. So feel free to use the chat function if you've got any questions at this point, and we can go back and give examples or further explain things.
Right. And I don't know if it is tenable to kind of let people speak their questions, because sometimes that might be easier. One of the questions here is, how do we contextualize our service learning experiences for our students? And I'll start on it, and if you want to jump in, Melissa, that would be great. So for us, contextualizing first and foremost comes with doing a deep dive into historical understandings of how places came to be what they are. A lot of what we talk about, especially given the way the east side of Buffalo is situated, and the east side of Buffalo is not very different from on urban enclaves that are primarily Black. There are lots of them in most major cities, segregated. And our students tend to believe that the segregation is a matter of choice, not a matter of government policy. And so part of the contextualizing is really beginning to tell the story of how a place came to be what it is, telling the story that goes beyond the discussion of individual choice to a discussion of, well, what is the history? What is the evidence? What are people doing? What are the power relations? And how do we make those much more visible and obvious? Do you want to jump in, Melissa?
I was just reading some of the, yeah. So I think for contextualization, it's important for students to have that a history of the communities they're entering, especially if they're not, even if they are, like, so for instance, given if in our situation, even if they are from Buffalo, they don't necessarily know how Buffalo became the way that it is. Part of that involves giving them a history. And maybe it's an uncomfortable history for them to learn too. I think that's part of it. And I think it's really important to be clear about what our goals and objectives are, you know, that what we want them to be thinking about and when they're engaging in work. And I think this is partly goes to answering the question, how do you prepare students effectively, from Laura. There's an intellectual preparation necessary, but the thing about good service learning is that it's an intellectual journey and it's an emotional one. Mm-hmm. And because good service learning is going to disrupt our sense of the world and therefore our sense of self, we have to also be prepared as teachers to be on that emotional journey with them. And I don't know that universities are good at supporting us in that yet, but I think it's a realization that we have to come to, that if we're going to do meaningful service learning work, we're going to have to meet them in different ways than we're used to. And Jonathan asks,
wait, Melissa, there's another part of that question where someone says, how do we get faculty engaged? And also, how do we prepare faculty to prepare students? And one of the things that we have begun to do is to take faculty on Immersion East Side. And this has been really rewarding because we can have deep conversations with our colleagues, and also because we bring different perspectives to how our colleagues may have been pursuing a particular issue. And remember, a lot of this history is not just unknown by our students, it is often unknown by our faculty. So the notion of redlining, many people think that the economic harms that are racialized are often grounded in slavery. And we got a lot of buy-in from our more business and numerically oriented faculty when we began to talk about how redlining operates, how it affects businesses, how it affects the possibilities of entrepreneurship and those kinds of things. So I would argue that getting faculty engaged is appealing to their intellectual interests and also sharing with them this uncomfortable, not much talked about history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our program, Immersion Eastside in Buffalo, began as a student program, and then we realized that faculty wanted to be involved, and so we also, well, not this year, but we also have run faculty immersions, like a mini version, so that faculty can have the kind of experience that students do. Because if you're at a university or a college, most likely your faculty are not from that area. You know, we all do national job searches. So to bring your faculty on board, they have to have a kind of experience similar to the students, a transformative experience that, you know, that can work for them. And we have business faculty who do really good service learning. And it's about finding projects and working with community partners to find projects that can be really embedded in particular classes and programs. Jonathan has a question about service learning in a semester that might be online. Yeah, so I would not send students out into the world this semester. I think that is I think it's a moral duty not to make students go out into the world right now. But I think there's lots of really interesting projects that can be done. So right here in Buffalo, one of PPG's projects is fair fines and fees. And we can work with students to say, comb through the data. And then students begin to identify the trends in the allocations of fines and fees to build the case that, Buffalo's fines and fees system is, disproportionately harming people of color in Buffalo. Right. That could be a kind of digital project.
Right. And given that there is a lot of work underway with that, another piece of it that is not that technical too is getting students to understand how these fines and fees adversely impact people who tend to be under-resourced, communities that tend to be over-policed. And someone had a question about how service learning in our experience has reinforced certain kinds of biases in our students. I think that's an accurate account of that question. Do you want to say a bit and I'll jump in, Melissa?
Yeah, I'll give a particular example. We used to partner with a very large local organization that served a lot of the homeless or housing insecure population in Buffalo. And students often went down and served meals, which is kind of the classic sort of Catholic way of doing service, right? I'm a lifelong Catholic, I've done a lot of this. And that semester, when I had a lot of students working at that particular site and reading their reflections, a lot of the same things emerged. Some of the same controlling images that Davanya mentioned, the welfare mother. The students would write, this woman came in every time and she brought 10 kids with her, right? Or I don't know why they're coming to get free meals when they have iPhones. And unless we're really intentional about disrupting those images and those narratives, sometimes those controlling images are just reinforced for them. I don't know if that example helps. Davanya, do you have another one that you might offer?
I think about education often. So students who often do service and after school programs or come in and say, well, they don't want to work hard, or parents are not interested in education because they're not showing up at the school. And they don't necessarily understand that maybe the parent doesn't have a car. Maybe the school is across town and they have to take 2 or 3 buses to get there, and they're working a job that if they miss being at work, they don't get paid for that day and they can't afford that. So they don't see those complications. They just see this student that they view as not being fully supported or not fully invested in the educational process. And so it reinforces this idea that people are not about moving out of the position where they find themselves. They also tend not to understand all the dynamics or most of the dynamics that come into play. And I'm thinking about it in a class where I was talking about this, and one of my students said, how hard is it to avoid 3 felonies in reference to the 3 strikes you're outlaw? And I said, well, for you, you're from the suburbs, so probably not so hard. So let's walk through the life of someone who finds themselves in a position of having 3 felonies. They're usually living in an over-policed neighborhood. So they may get into the criminal justice system through a school resource officer doing basic kinds of things that adolescents and kids do. And that behavior becomes criminalized, they get set up, and so on and so forth. So one of the other pieces, I'm going to transition and we can talk about that one a little more because Melissa is usually my time guard on us getting through these slides. So another piece for us that we engage is reorienting students to think about how the people they see themselves serving see them. So when we talk about arrogant perception, for the most part, students invited into service learning settings tend to be engaged in work where they're serving meals, where they're helping kids with homework. They don't often ask, well, what do the people I encounter think about me? What do they think I'm bringing? And someone asked the question, well, is service, when we think about service, are we talking about a particular skill set that students are bringing? And I think that question of what is service is something we should hold on to and perhaps re-ask it again when we've gotten through the second part of this.
Yeah, a lot of the questions that are coming up are things we're planning on getting into. So I think we'll shift to talking more about decolonial praxis and our own program, because I know there's some questions in the chat about that. All right. So having gone through the coloniality of power and ways in which service learning can reinforce the coloniality of power through various power relations, we're proposing some goals for and objectives for decolonial service learning. I don't think this is an exhaustive set, but this is what we've been trying to do in our work. And we've been trying, interestingly, we've been trying to do it, but we didn't have names for all of these things until we started doing this research. And for us as philosophers, it's been fun to take our experience and bring theory to that. Usually we do it the other way around. So I'm going to talk about the first two. The first one is disrupting and shifting narratives to give a fuller account of history. This came up in the chat a little bit, that students have stories about these communities already. When a lot of times when students come to Canisius, their parents tell them, well, don't leave campus. Don't go into the east side, it's dangerous, or don't go to the west side, which is another racialized community in Buffalo. It's dangerous. Because of those controlling images, they might have perceptions that people who live in disinvested areas made bad choices. They might believe that if someone really wanted to better their lives, they would just move to a better city or move to the suburbs. And a lot of the work that we have to do is to shift those narratives. So when we build the academic side of our service learning program or community-based program, the first thing that we talk about in Buffalo is redlining. Because before we can take our students into a disinvested community, we have to talk about the process and the policies by which that community became what it is. We talk about, and those of you who are in Buffalo or from Canisius, we talk about the construction of the 33, which decimated the east side of Buffalo and cut a neighborhood in half basically overnight. And so giving a fuller account of history begins to shift those controlling images, begins to shift the narratives that have already settled into students' worldviews. And this is an ongoing process. Giving a fuller account of history for us also means focusing not just on suffering and not just on injustice, but a fuller account of history also involves focusing on the active resistance that has always been a part of communities facing injustice, to focus on the resilience of members in that community and on the wisdom that already exists in those communities. Right. So that's the first thing when the academic side is building and shifting those narratives. And that goes a long way to preparing students to think differently about their service learning experiences, because they can no longer just ignore the history or the policies that produce, say, Buffalo as a very segregated city. We are also interested in developing political literacy. We're borrowing the idea of political literacy from the work of Paulo Freire. Freire's work has greatly influenced both Devanya and I's scholarship and also our teaching practices over the years. Political literacy for Freire is an awareness that one can choose the conditions of one's life, a recognition of one's agency to affect change. Oftentimes we find students looking at a grave injustice in the world and being like so overwhelmed that they can't even imagine what they could do. That they can't even imagine trying to alter the economic and political structures that produce injustice. So political literacy is not just knowing about the world, but it's an awareness of one's capacity to make change in that world. And so that's where our community partners are so important to us, because our community partners are doing exactly that. They are working to change those structures. And so seeing those examples is an important part of developing political literacy.
Okay, and I want to streamline on that. So when we talk about political literacy as well, we're not talking about degrees or necessarily talking about book knowledge, but a critical awareness. So often even the most literate, quote unquote, literate person, namely trained in a school or university, may in fact be politically illiterate. And that's within the literature. So the idea is a critical awareness, a critical knowledge, and we'll talk some more about that later on. On our third point, the idea of building coalitions, not necessarily community. So we don't want to preempt the idea that we can be in community with our partners. However, I think there is a tendency to rush toward community, something that, again, Patricia Williams talks about as the false luxury of a prematurely imagined community. In other words, being in community with groups and persons is not simply showing up to engage in a common exercise. It involves a deep understanding about their material conditions, a kind of respect for their lived experience in the world, and also a way of critically engaging what all of us have been trained not to see or taught to ignore, even if we do see it. So how do we make apparent those things that we tend to ignore? So we tend to distinguish the idea of a coalition, namely working in partnership with someone, from community. And often we hear people say, oh, we're in community. Well, you have to be invited into community. And you have to work for it. It's something one earns. And this sort of slides into kinship relationships. So the idea of being in relationship with partners or fostering relationships is often transactional. We're going to get this from them and we're bringing that. And often that overburdens community-based organizations. So remember, many of the places where we're sending students are under-resourced. And then we're asking these community-based institutions to utilize their resources in managing our students. That takes away from their resources. So part of being in a kinship relationship is much like a family. How do we think about collectively sharing resources? How do we move out of a transactional relationship into relationships that are grounded in communal care? So they're care relationships. So if you think about many communities of color, and I'm going to talk about the Black community, you want to get to know somebody's people before you engage in something with them. You want to have a conversation. You want to get a sense of who that person is before you begin to talk business. And that, to me, is indicative of a kinship relationship.
Okay. So this is our proposal for decolonial praxis. We're going to talk about resistance to colonial unknowing, disrupting warfare by narrative means, world traveling, playfulness, and world building, and creating space for difference. So colonial unknowing is another idea that we get from Christy Dotson, the one who proposed the coalitions, not community, which it seems people are really liking. I'm glad for that. She talks about colonial unknowing as part of the history of the United States. And colonial unknowing is a set of practices that produce historical unknowing about all of our originating stories in the US. And it facilitates compliance with settler colonialism. So we resist this kind of unknowing by making space for narratives and wisdoms that do not serve the political status quo. What we mean by this is there's some parts of history that we've wiped off, right? We've wiped out of the books, right? Or it's not something that is part of conversation anymore. I think about what I learned as United States history in, the early 90s when I was in school versus what I know now, and how wrong the history I learned, turns out to be. And so resisting colonial unknowing means producing knowledges or resurrecting knowledges that give a fuller account of our originating stories. Vanya?
So disrupting colonial unknowing also requires us to disrupt what Anibal Quijano refers to as warfare by narrative means. And I think many of us, as we look at the news and look at how things unfold in politics and reporting, we understand how the story orients us to understanding the world. So embedded in narratives are the operations of power, operations and workings of certain power relationships. And those narratives support a certain kind of political economy. I remember talking to someone about the idea of preemptive framing. In other words, if I get to frame the very way in which we're going to talk about something, I also control what kinds of questions can be asked. I control what counts as legitimate, what kinds of things we're going to attend to, and all of that is part of the narratives that I construct. And as Melissa was saying, if we are engaged in processes of unknowing, they are supported by the narratives we tell about the world in which we live. So if there are no indigenous people who were displaced to settle the West, if there are no economic benefits from enslaved people, if there are no incidences of interning racialized people, then the kinds of narratives we talk about support our everyday understanding. So one of the things we have to do with our students is disrupt this kind of willful not knowing. And we want to distinguish this from something like ignorance, because ignorance is simply not knowing. I also think we are taught to not want to know, or in the case of people who operate only within one predominant community, like the suburbs, they don't need to know. They don't need to know what to do when they get pulled over by a police officer, because that experience is going to be very different for them if they're white. And that's a kind of unknowing, needing not to know and not knowing. Okay.
Maria Lugones always also offers us the idea of world traveling. She distinguishes between agonistic world traveling, where we go to another's world to conquer them, but not necessarily literally, but when we go to a community that is not our own and try to study it, to try to understand it, we objectify that community. And that's a kind of epistemic conquering. So she says when we travel to others' worlds, we can't do so as an imperialist, but she talks about being playful, to be imaginative, to be open to change and new directions, rather than as the arrogant perceiver, as we talked about earlier. So when we travel to another's world, it's possible that we can begin to see them as subjects in their own lives, as agents in their own lives, and not just as objects and victims of injustice. And Debo?
Okay, and that leads us into the idea of or an anti-assimilationist pedagogy. So often we talk about, or I hear my students talk about the need for Blacks to assimilate into white culture, or to, develop these ways of being respectable. And what it does is it denies these important ways of being different that give us energy, that are creative, that engage. And so when Audre Lorde talks about the necessity of polarities, what she means is that we're not trying to unify these differences. And one of my favorite metaphors for the lack of unified differences is the idea of a musical chord. And I know Andrea has heard me talk about this before, but in order to have a musical chord, you have to have dissonance and difference. They actually produce this beautiful thing in the form of music, but dissonance is necessary. And I think, again, in rushing to identify and rushing to make people the same, we often want to cover over difference, because difference is difficult. Difference requires negotiation. Difference requires conversation, and it requires us to slow down and take time to develop understanding, to work things out. And so it's also a requirement that we see ourselves as interdependent as well.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about our program, Immersion Eastside, its history, it's the struggles that we have had developing it, the changes that we've made to it over the last 10 years. Our Immersion Eastside program is designed as a seminar. It is a 3-credit bearing course. It meets some core requirements in our core curriculum at Canisius. It involves a summer portion, 12-day immersion. So the students are together for 12 days over the summer. We stay in the dorms, and we spend all of our days meeting with community members, community organizations. But it's designed as a seminar that it forefronts the academic and intellectual work that it's going to take to begin to unpack our experiences that we have in the community. And it's designed as an Ignatian seminar, where we're looking at not only educating the mind, but also educating the heart as well.
Right. Can I jump in for a minute, yeah. Melissa? There's a question about incorporating people in the community to be instructors and teachers. And I think the model you're describing does that in a way without the bureaucratic complications of universities. In other words, in order to actually hire someone to teach in a seminar requires all kinds of paperwork, and I'm not arguing that that shouldn't be considered. Our model, in a lot of ways, relies upon people in the community to actually teach our students about their experiences, to offer the critical framework through which they understand the world. And I think a lot about it in terms of when we go, for example, to a parent group that is dealing with public schools in our city. And most major cities have all kinds of issues with public schools, and public schools are largely populated by racialized students. Listening to parents talk about the kinds of things that they undertake to ensure a quality education for their children is often quite powerful for our students, because they sort of see failing schools as just failing. They don't understand that people within their material conditions have to work out how best to give their children opportunities that are often already granted to folks who live in the suburbs. And that's because of tax structures and other things that we can't quite go into. So the answer would be yes. We see community members as instructors on par with us, if you will. Not that I'm so great, but they are knowledge producers that have a different kind of knowledge than we do from the academic standpoint, but it is a knowledge that is as important, if not more important.
So yeah, that covers, I'll jump down. That covers kind of engaging the community as teachers, which is the fourth point there. But also the fifth point, which is compensating community members. We don't often think about the amount of work that goes into supervising students who are doing service projects. And that is something that institutions really need to think about. Sometimes having a group of students working with you can be a burden. And not that they're not getting good experience and not that they're not helping in some way, but we really need to work on a compensation model for those people who are doing a lot of work to help us teach service courses. But I want to jump up to the second bullet point there. So one thing that's kind of odd about Devanya and I's program, and odd about us talking about service learning, is that we don't do any service as it's traditionally thought of in our Immersion Eastside program. We have such a limited amount of time with students, and we want to give them the most exposure to the most variety of community projects that we can, that we don't engage in direct service in those 12 days. We have, right? Sometimes if you want to meet with someone, you got to do some work alongside them, and so that's fine, we do that. But I think it's important to rethink what service means and what counts as service. And this is going to be especially important in the COVID era. It might not mean going out to soup kitchens. It might not mean tutoring students at a school. It might not mean playing basketball at the Boys and Girls Club. Service and being of service to another person or being of service to a community might not be embedded in distinct projects. Rather than doing service, our students engage in what we call upstream course projects. So our students design projects to educate the larger Canisius or Buffalo community about what they have learned. We have had students do our last group of students made podcasts on topics of gentrification, policing, and homelessness in Buffalo. So these are service, right? They're doing something important, but it's not that kind of face-to-face direct service that we often see when we think about it through the lens of charity. Devanya, I'll turn it over to you.
So someone said, well, what do your partners get? And I think that varies in terms often of what partners ask us for and what we discuss with them. I mean, often we say, we don't want to do this in a way that takes away the limited resources you have. What are the kinds of things that we can do that utilize resources we have as an institution to support the work you're doing? So it's not, when we talk about compensation, it's not always money. Sometimes it is being respectful and paying someone who comes to campus to talk to our students about something, or someone who gives their time making a donation to their nonprofit, but it's not always about money. Sometimes it is, I know we've been trying to do some work with PPG partners around Court Watch. It is sort of beginning to engage in projects that communities are already doing from a position of being informed. So I'd say partners often get, if we're doing this right, and granted, we don't always do it as well as we'd like to, but partners will typically get someone who's already educated about the issues, who is oriented to becoming engaged with them on projects that they are already undertaking. So they lend their hands, their work ethic. Maybe they need to put up ribbons because someone is trying to draw attention to needing to restore a parkway that was disrupted by a highway project. So which one was I supposed to do?
You're going to Decolonial lexicon now.
Okay, so in keeping with this, you've heard some of our language around things like, rather than saying people in poverty, we talk about people who are under-resourced. We talk about gentrification and redlining and reverse redlining. And so a lot of this is about building a lexicon that questions the typical language we use, like urban and suburban. We dig into what those words mean, and then we begin to talk about really what's at stake. So students often use terms like ghetto to be synonymous with a particular culture, with particular cultural practices, without realizing that the term ghetto was invoked in the 60s to talk about the way that Jewish people were ghettoized and prevented from living in other parts of cities. Isn't this the same when we talk about redlining? So it gives a depth and a historical context for terms that they often throw around, and it also makes them aware of the power relations at stake when they use certain kinds of terminology. Okay. Am I doing intellectual humility?
You're going all the way down.
Oh, thank you. So the other thing that is important for us is constant reflection. We get things wrong often. There are times when our framing's not quite right, when we may offend, and how do we reflect upon that so that we can do it better? How do we reflect upon things so that we really begin to understand what things are unfolding when we're in meetings with community partners? Because sometimes students are shocked to find positions that are unexpected, maybe positions that are much more patriarchal, where they orient women as in need of saving and care and in need of managing their bodies in ways that don't draw attention from men. And to come back and debrief and reflect on what happened, how those narratives are often in conflict with this idea of gender equality or racial equality. So that's one thing. And this goes to intellectual humility as well, because we need that ongoing reflection to constantly redo how we theorize about the work we're doing. How do we bring it into the classroom, and how do we exercise this understanding that sometimes we might just be mistaken and we need care corrections in order to do better. So we hold these as aspirational goals and think they are part of a practice. And I want to say we like the idea of practice because practice presumes that we get it wrong, but we continue a kind of repetition and an engagement that moves us toward getting it more right.
So for instance, on this point about intellectual humility, we've made significant changes to the program in the last 10 years. If you were to look at the founding documents of our program, for instance, the original documents talk about the east side of Buffalo as a different world and a different country, just like when we do our international service immersions. That's colonialism. And we've had to shift our own thinking and our own narrative the more we learn and the more we reflect on our practices. So we don't always get it right. I think there's some things we get really right, and there's some things that we are constantly going to be working on. We think about these things and as aspirational, because the communities that we work in and the communities that we work with are constantly changing. We have to be willing to change and adapt along with them. So of course, institutional commitments, right? You know, the traditional model of service learning might be pretty easy. You just work with a community partner, you tell your students to go out and do 10 hours of service, they get their sheet signed, they write a reflection about it, everyone's better. But I think we think that can fall into the trap of coloniality of power. And so programs that really do service learning well, that can really have an effect to decolonize the mind and decolonize the curriculum, require huge investment. Huge investment. But a college or university or school that's willing to do this or is interested in doing this is going to have to make those investments. The time it takes to build and maintain community relationships. Devanya and I have spent hours and hours and hours, weeks of our lives, building our community partnerships, building trust with community partners. That's something that just takes a lot of work. It takes time to develop courses around community-based learning rather than to just dump community-based learning in there. And it's going to take money, investment in faculty, and then also investment in the community. We have to pay the community back for giving to us what it gives us when we do service learning. Right. Devanya?
Right. One of the other things that's very important is this idea that we are willing to change our approach, willing to change the kinds of things we are doing when we enter into communities. We've got to not assume we know the narrative when we walk into a community. We have to create space to hear how the people we are engaged with, how do they construct their narrative? How do they tell the story of their community, their challenges, and also their joys, their ability to carve a kind of agency out of spaces where they've been denied agency. And this means that also our institutions have to change. And I know someone asked, well, aren't educational institutions part of the model of coloniality? Absolutely, they are. And we have to be honest and straightforward about the ways in which institutions are designed to reinforce existing power relationships. And we have to constantly question and challenge that, which is a tricky tension. And sometimes we do better and sometimes we do worse. Often our students say to us, well, isn't gentrification good? Isn't it great that all this development is happening in areas that have been disinvested? And the answer is yes and no. It's complicated. And the final thing is that the way we measure our successes in decolonial service learning, because again, the academy is often in a model of coloniality, we have to use non-standard measures. We have to use a different kind of metric and maybe we question the use of metrics altogether. Maybe we think about our aspirational goals and our engagements as measuring the success of our programs. How much do we get into communities? How much do we amplify narratives of communities that the communities themselves create? And for us, that's very important. And a final metric for me that has been super important is understanding that the people we encounter are not just oppressed, immiserated people. They are people who craft a life often under very difficult circumstances, who have systemic challenges that they have found creative ways to respond to. And so when we go into a Black church, for example, there's a kind of joy there, a joy in living that is not displaced by the material conditions people face. And for me, that is very important because I come from that tradition. And I come from a tradition that is beyond survival. We celebrate life, and we celebrate life even in the face of oppression. And I think it's important for students to understand that. Before we break, and I know we're a little bit over time, people were talking about needing to shift out what service means in terms of COVID. And I would push us to think about service not only as being physically in a location serving food, but also what are the kinds of intellectual and research work that institutions need? What are the kinds of sorting through that organizations need colleges and communities to do? A while back, students from Immersion East Side got engaged with developing marketing plans for local businesses in a corridor. What did they call it? A beautifying project in a corridor. And some of the local businesses needed marketing plans. That's service. You get your marketing students under the guidance of a professor to do a marketing plan. Are there data analytics that can be crunched in order to benefit community groups? And these are the kinds of things that we encourage people to think of as service. And Melissa referred to this upstream, downstream notion. Our idea is that we get to a point where we don't have to do downstream work because we've done so much upstream. In other words, yes, we need to save babies from the river, but we also want to eliminate the kinds of conditions that make babies end up in rivers. And that's, I'm sorry, it's a kind of shaky metaphor, and feel free to ask more about that. So we close with the Audre Lorde quote. And that, I think, is an important feature of what we think we're doing when we are engaged in decolonial practice around service learning, that we are consistently and rigorously evaluating not only where we are, but how that informs the future that we wish to create. And it also involves being deliberate and clear about the kinds of injustices. We often talk about the theory of justice, but another thing Melissa and I do is that we talk extensively about the nature of injustice, because that's the part of the equation that students don't often understand. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Devanya and Melissa. I want to thank all of our participants and acknowledge that we're past our 2 o'clock time. Possibly Devanya and Melissa might have a few minutes if there are burning questions remaining. And so if you want to stay on and have a little conversation, feel free to. But for the rest of the participants, thank you for joining us. We will be emailing you all with a recording of the presentation with this slide deck. And I see a question of, do you have a reading list or citations? And I know, Melissa, that on the next slide you do. So this will go out to all participants as well.